And good afternoon for the official start of our World Oregon webinar with the author Sam Kaplan talking about his book, Challenging China. I'll hand it over to Sam in just a minute or two. I know we still have some folks coming in from the Zoom waiting room. Today's program is part of a World Oregon series of webinars, vast majority of which are free for World Oregon members and supporters. If you're not a World Oregon member, I encourage you to sign up to become one at worldoregon.org. A reminder, we have a great program on Thursday with Tim Tran about his book, American Dreamer, his life story coming from Vietnam after the war to Pacific University and the incredible life he's had. And we have a program for Pride Month later on in June that's also up on our website, working with a group called Outright Action International that we partnered with before in past events. A reminder that Zoom Oregon webinars, that only the audience only has the ability to post things in the Q&A or the chat, and World Oregon staff and presenters are the ones using the audio and video. This program will be recorded and posted on YouTube later. If you have questions for the speaker, we encourage you to post them in the Q&A function of Zoom. And we will be posting in the chat links on how to buy the book, sign up for his newsletter, and other items of interest. Again, we're excited to have him here, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce Sam, who I've known for several years from his days leading the Trade Development Alliance in Greater Seattle, which does a lot of work on promoting international trade investment, Pacific Northwest, similar to the Pacific Northwest International Trade Association here in the Portland metro area. And he's out with a new book, which is Challenging China, Smart Strategies for Dealing with China in the Xi Jinping Era. And he's not afraid to tackle some tough questions. So we're looking forward to both interesting presentation and tough questions from you, the audience. He's done a variety of roles of trade and investment in the Pacific Northwest. He's worked on the Hill. He's worked with, he's published author and as a newsletter, as I mentioned. So really has a lot of knowledge and on the ground experience. And we're just thrilled to have him join us. So without further ado, I pass it over to Sam.
Thanks, Derek, very much appreciate it. Let me share my screen here, and thanks everybody. It's good to be here today. I always like being in Oregon, even if it's just virtually like today. I have family in Oregon. My wife's brother and family live in McMinnville. We get down there fairly often, and I'm still heartbroken that Pok Pok, one of my favorite restaurants, did not survive the pandemic. So anyway, great to be here today. Hopefully you can see my presentation. I'm going to talk about one of the 4 most important issues in the world, what to do about a more authoritarian, more expansionist China. And I go into a lot of fun-loving detail about this in my book, Challenging China, which is, I think Derek and Tim have said, is available at Broadway Books or anywhere you can buy reading material, except probably you can't get it in China or in Hong Kong. If you want to know about the other 3 most important issues in the world, you have to wait for my next book, which I'm about 15,000 words into. And looking forward to hearing your questions. Yeah, feel free to ask me anything or bring up any topic you want. I've been working with China in one way or another for basically my whole career. First back when I worked on foreign affairs and trade issues for a U.S. representative back in DC, which seems like about 1,000 years ago now, and in various business capacities and now in higher education. And like a lot of people working and dealing with China, I became more and more concerned in the 2013s about what was happening there. Which brings me to the Great Escalator Incident of 2015. I was part of the host committee that organized the visits of Xi Jinping and President Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping in 2015 and President Hu in 2006 to Seattle. And really the differences in the 2 visits reflected the changes that were taking place in China. When Xi came, there was a big gala dinner at the Westin Hotel in downtown Seattle. And I was one of the people in charge of that, organizing that dinner and the substance and everybody that was invited and everything. Now there's a set of escalators in the lobby of that hotel that Chinese security asked us to turn off for the entire duration of Xi's stay there. But that would have been against the fire code and against the law, and they were told no, we couldn't do that. And also that we had security measures in place to protect President Xi and all the other dignitaries that were in the hotel. So in the afternoon of the dinner hadn't started, but there were meetings taking place in the hotel, and I found myself walking by the escalators, and yep, they were turned off. And nearby, I saw the head of the U.S. Secret Service, who I'd been working with, and he said the Chinese security themselves physically turned off the escalators. He decided it wasn't worth fighting with them about. They'd leave them turned off, closed for about a half hour or so. So China was much more assertive, willing to buck law, common sense, and even the U.S. Secret Service. In 2006, during Hu's visit, early on, Hu's advanced teams asked for suggestions on what to do and when to do it. They even asked how to avoid rush hour. And Hu's advanced teams, from the early people that came early in the planning of the visit, they were empowered to make decisions. With Xi in 2015, they told us what to do, did things when they wanted, did not care at all about disrupting traffic in Seattle, and really no decisions were finally made until Xi's inner circle came about 5 days before the trip, which, as you can imagine, made organizing the trip relatively difficult. China was quickly becoming a different place. It had become more oppressive, it's become more closed, and it's become more expansionist. And that's a bad combination for the world. Now, right after Xi became president, he did a tour of South China, and he gave a book that was received very favorably by the world. In fact, it started having some people opining that he would become a reformer. But during that same tour, he gave a secret speech to party members where he talked about the lessons the party needed to learn from the fall of the Soviet Union, and that the Communist Party of China needed to take all measures to make sure that did not happen there in China. That speech made clear that rather than reform, there would be just the opposite. So over the next 7 years, Xi has given a lot of speeches, and if you read them carefully, and I don't necessarily advise that you do because some of them are 3 hours long and full of lots of party jargon, but he made clear that China aims to supplant the liberal world order and make the world safe for authoritarianism. Human rights have deteriorated measurably over the last decade under Xi's rule. Most famously in Xinjiang, which is in the western part of China, the Xi government is committing what many would call genocide. In fact, Biden's Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has called it exactly that. China has swept up more than 1 million Uyghurs, who are an ethnic Muslim minority group, into concentration camps, and there they're forcibly what's called re-educated. Last summer came credible reports that the government is forcibly sterilizing Uyghur women so they can't have children. And this winter came reports of systematic rape of Uyghur women prisoners. And China's efforts to suppress the population is succeeding. Between 2017 and 2019, the birth rate in Xinjiang fell in half. China's actions in Xinjiang are one of the great human rights abuses of the 21st century. It's not the only human rights abuses China is committing, which has become more oppressive since Xi took over in 2013. When Xi became president, he instituted a corruption crackdown. At the time, I happened to be organizing then Seattle Mayor McGinn's trip to Seattle's sister city of Chongqing. So as we were organizing the trip, a guy named Wang Lijun, who was the police chief of Chongqing, and he was connected to a guy named Bo Xilai, and Bo Xilai was a possible rival to Xi. Well, Wang Lijun, he called someone I know in the nearby consulate in Chengdu and said, "Hey, I want to meet with you. I want to talk to you about economic matters." So the guy I know said, "Sure, come on over." He gets to the consulate, he gets in the room with the guy I know, and he says to this guy, "I want to defect." So the guy I know, he tells me, I immediately left the room and got people more used to dealing with this kind of situation than an economic person like himself would. So this was a huge news story the week before we went to Chongqing. We weren't even sure if we should still go, but eventually Mayor McGinn did, and you can see a photo of him here with Mayor Wang after their meeting. And they had a meeting, and it was a very strange meeting. Mayor Wang talked for 45 minutes in parables, didn't even let our mayor get a word in edgewise. Some of his parables included parables about Jesus Christ. Like I say, it was a very strange meeting, very unusual, especially from our past work with China. But he was under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure because of this corruption crackdown. And this corruption crackdown swept up about 2 million officials, both high rank and low. And again, it started right after Xi took office, but it's been expansive and has been ongoing. In 2013, there were 172,000 investigations, 330,000 in 2015, and 527,000 in 2017. Among the high brought low are 7 at the Politburo and cabinet level, but the campaign swept up a broad swath of national, provincial, and local leaders throughout China, people like Wang Lijun. One writer has called it a generational cleanout. And there was plenty of corruption to clean out, but the campaign also served a second purpose of solidifying Xi's grip on power. As this was happening, also when Xi took office, there was a human rights crackdown. More than 200 lawyers in China involved in human rights issues were questioned and detained right after Xi became president. And then in 2015, in what became known as the 709 crackdown, which is named after the date it started, July 9th, there was a crackdown on human rights lawyers again and on human rights activists in general around the country. More than 250 such people were arrested, and many of them are still jailed and detained to this day. And of course, China has become more censorious of the internet over the years, so that now it's very difficult to get information, free information on the internet. So China is more authoritarian than it was, but it's also become more expansionist. And I don't just mean geographically in terms of trying to take over land, though they're doing a bit of that. Here, for example, is a map of the South China Sea where China is claiming large swaths of territory. The blue dotted lines here, those are the lines that were set by rulings of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So really it's international law based on where the borders would be. The red dotted lines, here's China. The red dotted lines are China's unilaterally based zones, no basis in international law at all. To give a little bit of perspective, they're claiming territorial waters more than 1,000 miles from their borders. That's a little bit like Portland claiming Chicago as part of its city, that Oregon invented deep dish pizza. But China's expansionism is really more than geographic. They're attempting to change the post-World War II, post-Cold War liberal world order into one that they can control. They're trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism. One example of this is something called the United Nations International Telecommunications Union, or ITU. That name, it sounds like one that was created by people to help insomniacs get to sleep. It sounds very boring. But China is actively using this organization to propagate facial recognition technology standards onto the world. The ITU is actually the oldest global international organization. It was originally the International Telegraph Union, but today it has responsibility for creating standards for global telecommunications technology. And China is changing these standards to make it easier to use government surveillance technology to spy on its citizens. And they're also exporting to and helping developing countries use this technology to repress their own citizens. So the UN International Telecommunications Union is maybe not so boring after all, and something that we need to pay attention to. China, of course, has also become more vocal about Taiwan and about the possibility of invading it. It's repeatedly been flying fighter jets into Taiwan airspace, and it's been more vocal about military plans to possibly invade Taiwan. And the People's Daily, the main government-run newspaper, they printed a commentary earlier this year that used a phrase that they rarely have used. It translates into, "Don't say I didn't warn you." It sounds like a schoolyard taunt, but that specific wording was used in editorials by the paper in 1962, just before China went to war with India, and in 1979 before China invaded Vietnam. China, of course, has also cracked down on Hong Kong. Last week, June 4th, was the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. In the past, Hong Kongers gathered by the thousands, including in Victoria Park, to commemorate what happened there 30 years ago. This year, it was illegal to gather, and Victoria Park itself was blocked off by the police. Now, the UK colonized Hong Kong, but reached an agreement with China to turn it back over in 1997, but with a stipulation it would operate under a basic agreement that preserved certain freedoms in Hong Kong. It was what was called a one country, two systems arrangement. However, as China became more authoritarian and started instilling its norms in Hong Kong, protests grew in the city, especially beginning in 2014 during what became known as the Umbrella Movement. The protesters used umbrellas to protect themselves from tear gas. I happened to be there. Whoops, I forgot to stay on the slide. I happened to be in Hong Kong during those protests for work. and went down and met with some of the protesters or talked to some of the protesters. And I took this photo. And I remember talking to them and asking some of them if they were scared. I talked to this one young woman, said, "Aren't you scared to be doing this?" And she told me she was confident they would win. They were so young at the time, and I was amazed at their courage and worried for them. And I was right to be, because now all those protest leaders, they're either in jail or they're in exile. And that's because late last year, there were more protests, and Hong Kong and China cracked down on them violently. Then China passed a national security law, which prohibits free speech and assembly in Hong Kong, and even by people like you and me talking about freedom in Hong Kong here and elsewhere around the world. I could easily be breaking this national security law during this Zoom session. But even as China became more oppressive, its economy continued to grow. This is a photo of the Pudong area of Shanghai. Back in the early 1990s, it was essentially farmland. Today, as you can see, it looks like a modern Manhattan or Tokyo. Since China opened up in 1979, and especially since the 1990s, China has become one of the great economic successes in human history. That's partly because China is huge, so they're achieving things at a scale not seen previously. Here you see a representation of their population. As you can see, China and India are about the same size population-wise, although in the next few years, India will become more populous than China. It's even possible that's already the case. China has been probably miscounting their population, as they often miscount their economic data. But China's economy is big. It's the second largest economy in the world, behind only the United States. And this gives it great geopolitical leverage. Companies and people want to sell and invest in such a large market. It's a great lure. But in per capita terms, China is actually far behind the US, European countries, Japan, and many other countries. And its GDP per capita is also much lower than other Asian tigers, such as South Korea and Taiwan, at similar time periods of development. China's GDP per capita increased from a very low level 40 years ago, but is still far behind where one might expect it to be after 40 years of high growth. A myth about China is they're only a copycat economy, that they merely steal intellectual property. And in fact, they do steal intellectual property, but they're also a great innovator. Two things can be true at the same time. They're well ahead of the US and other countries, for example, in mobile payments, and have been for quite a long time. You can buy just about anything with your phone. You don't need a credit card. You don't need to cash from a store. You can even use your phone to give money to homeless people. China's also working on artificial intelligence. They're using the large amounts of data they collect to help them. Large data sets help drive machine learning for AI. And they're making great strides in biotechnology. A few years ago, I met with the CEO of a biotechnology company called BGI. They're located or headquartered in the south of China in Xinjiang, which is just near Hong Kong. And BGI is the largest repository of sequenced genomes in the world. They were recently featured on 60 Minutes for their trying to collect data from Americans, because BGI has offices and does work all over the world, as well as for some activities in Xinjiang to collect biometric data, which has made people very worried. Innovation, of course, can be used for both good and bad purposes. China is also great innovators in surveillance technology, including creating and using gait recognition technology, that is recognizing someone by the way they walk. It gives a whole new meaning to the Aerosmith song. All of China's economic success means they have been one of the great poverty alleviators in the history of the world. They brought more than 700 million people out of extreme poverty over the last 40 years. In fact, more people have risen out of poverty around the world than at any other time in history. And China is a big reason for that. Not the only reason, but they are a big reason for the decrease in poverty in the world over the last 70 years. China and Asia have become more and more important to the world economy over recent decades. They increasingly have large middle classes, and that's going to have a big impact on the world economy and on geopolitics in the coming years. And China's economic success means they're changing other parts of the world. You often will hear people complain about China providing unsustainable loans to Africa and to other developing countries, and then using these loans as leverage to extract things from those countries. And it's true, and it does happen. But separately, there are thousands of individual Chinese business people in Africa and other developing countries making investments, setting up factories. As China has become more expensive due to its economic success, as labor costs have risen and land prices have risen, these Chinese business people, not the government, set up factories in Kenya and Ghana and Ethiopia and other parts of Africa and other parts of the developing world. And in these factories, they're making clothing, shoes, and other items. And this is providing a chance for these countries to develop their own manufacturing capabilities and grow and develop as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China did. This phenomenon is already changing Southeast Asia for the better. Bangladesh, where there's a good chance your clothing was made, I think the shirt that I'm wearing was actually made in Bangladesh. They now have a higher GDP per capita than India or Pakistan. And just before the pandemic, I was working in Vietnam, and I toured a shoe factory there. That shoe factory had relocated from Vietnam to Vietnam from China about 5 years before that, so long before the U.S. China trade war. As China's labor became more expensive, manufacturing assembly was moving, and that's bringing new expertise and capability to other countries. So China's economic success is important, and it's been beneficial to the world in many ways. But today, China is facing economic headwinds. They have aging demographics, for one. There are too many Chinese that look like me and not enough that look like you young people in the audience. Under current trends, China's population in the next 20 years will actually be older than the United States. It's one of the reasons why their economy has slowed and will not grow at the rate it had previously. And remember that GDP growth comes from two things: an increase in productivity and an increase in the working age population. And China's working age population is already declining. Trends for birth rates have gotten worse in the last few years, not better. So their demographic situation is actually worsening. I think it was about a month ago, the Financial Times reported that China's census population would show a decrease in the overall population. China actually quickly denied that was the case. They claimed their population grew last year. But they didn't dispute something else in the article, and that's that the fertility rate is now down to 1.5 children per woman. Again, that's below what was used in projections that said China will get older and be older than the United States in 20 years. So China's going to get older and smaller sooner than we actually thought. And the second part of what drives GDP productivity, their productivity lags far behind other advanced countries. It's true their annual productivity increases are larger than developed countries, but those increases are gradually decreasing. And currently, each Chinese worker produces far less than South Koreans, Japanese, Americans, Mexicans, and many other countries' workers. China has sustained high GDP growth rates for years. I argue in my book that the era of high GDP growth in China is over. Because of catching up from the COVID pandemic, it's possible to have high growth rates this year. But after that, their GDP growth will be much similar to America's and Europe's than their high GDP growth of the last 30 years. So China is more authoritarian and they're more expansionist, and they've achieved great economic success, giving them much leverage in the world economy and in geopolitics, but they face great economic challenges going forward, and they're not going to have a fast-growing economy going forward. So what do we do about that situation? In my book, I recommend a number of policies to deal with China, but I also assert the most important thing we can do to deal with a more repressive, expansionist China is to improve our own country. I identify 4 big policy issues we need to address, but I also admit that I'm not omniscient and I don't have all the answers. In fact, in the website that I created for my book, I provide an opportunity for you all to give your recommendations on how to improve America. Feel free to go to samkaplanauthor.com and send on your own ideas. I will say that one of my 4 ideas has to do with American infrastructure, but probably not in the way that you're thinking, and certainly not in the way the Biden administration is talking about. How's that for a tease? Now you have to read the book. I also recommend moving human rights more to the forefront of American foreign policy with China. In my book, I explain how Jimmy Carter made human rights a larger component of US foreign policy, and how Reagan, after some missteps, also utilized it effectively. I figure if we can bring Carter and Reagan fans together, there's nothing we can't accomplish, as Biden likes to say. Human rights is, of course, a moral issue, but it's also the most treacherous landscape for China to traverse. They're committing genocide. They also fear their own citizens, which is why they must censor the internet and most other aspects of society. That, we have to remember, is a sign of weakness, not strength. Of course, whenever human rights are raised, China will say two things. First, they'll say it's an internal matter and we shouldn't be interfering in their internal affairs. And second, they'll say that who is America with its racial inequality problems to lecture China or anyone else about human rights issues. On the first one, as I write in the book, determining the rate of a capital gains tax is an internal affair. Debating the best route for a new high-speed rail line is an internal matter. The torture of Zumrat Dawood, a Uyghur, is a matter for the whole world. And on the second, Biden and other public officials can preface every human rights statement about China with, yep, we have our own issues to deal with, there's no doubt about it, but that does not excuse imprisoning over 1 million Uyghurs and forcibly sterilizing them. So the US has issues with China, but guess what? So do many other countries. On the economy, China's market is not just closed to American companies in many sectors, but to all countries' companies. And China's aggressive expansionist policies are affecting countries more than they are the US. Think about Vietnam and the South China Sea, for example. Or note that when Sweden's journalist organization decided to give an award to a Swedish citizen, Gui Minhai, born in China, but living in Sweden and a Swedish citizen, where he was traveling abroad, he was arrested and put in jail by China for writing stories critical of China. So they decided Swedish organization to give an award to Minhai. And this caused China's ambassador to threaten Sweden. He said, quote, "We firmly oppose representatives of the Swedish government attending such an event. And if they decide to stick to what they're doing, we'll have no choice but to take countermeasures. I believe some individuals in Sweden should not expect that when they hurt the interests and sentiments of China, things will just move on naturally." So China does not want other countries to interfere in their internal matters, but they have no problem interfering in other countries' internal matters, including giving an award to a Swedish citizen. The last 4 years, the US made creating alliances against China more difficult by applying tariffs, not just on China, but on nearly all of our allies in Europe, Canada, Japan, and elsewhere. The Biden administration has said it will make rebuilding alliances a priority, but it won't be easy. For one thing, it's a different world than it was 4 years ago. The rest of the world has moved on from America, creating their own alliances, whether the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we pulled out of, the trade agreement that the rest of Asia went forward with, or new supply chain alliances that are being created by places like Japan, India, and Australia. Plus, creating alliances will be difficult because commercial interests will be difficult to overcome. There was recently a survey of German companies, and it showed that they're not leaving China, that they have 96% have no plans to leave China next year. 72% are planning further investments, and 77% expect Chinese markets to develop better than others. And remember, I don't know if you saw the story maybe a month or so ago, that the Swedish retail store, clothing store, H&M, they'd had a statement on their website saying they would not use forced labor, cotton from forced labor to make their clothing, including in Xinjiang. Because of this, they became persona non grata in China. Their stores were wiped from online maps and became invisible in other ways. Well, H&M quickly took that statement off of their website. It's also going to be difficult for America to lead because a lot of people believe China is in decline. China itself believes America is in decline. As you can see from these two quotes, China has an opinion that we're declining. And they're not the only ones. Many countries feel this way. The attempted insurrection of January 6th only reinforced this belief for many around the world. Where once America was seen as a beacon of democracy, a place where anyone could find success, instead we had people in fur hats invading our Capitol building, a less than robust response to COVID-19, although now we're vaccinating our people better than most. But importantly, in that regard, we're not helping the rest of the world vaccinate. We're not playing a leadership role in helping the world get out of the pandemic. So the world adjusted to America's retreat from world leadership. China, of course, has become more assertive, but as noted, new alliances are being formed around the world to deal with China's new assertiveness. and China and America is no longer being a leader of the world. Europe entered into an investment agreement with China, although it appears that it won't be approved by individual countries. But places like Vietnam and Japan, their defense ministers have been consulting with each other. Japan has been helping Taiwan get vaccinations. Everybody is adjusting. Even with Trump gone and Biden now president, America's leadership role is not what it was and won't be in the future. Now, in the house I owned before I got married, I once transplanted a dwarf Japanese maple tree into a newly landscaped area I created in front of the house. It turned out to be a lot more difficult than I had thought. The roots of this small tree, and it was probably only about 1.5 feet tall, but the roots were deep and wide. But I kept digging and digging, and before I knew it, I dug up half of my front yard. Being a stubborn guy, I put the shovel back down in the ground, and clang, I hit metal. So at this point, I'm in this big hole, and I look up from the hole, and I realize I'm exactly parallel to the main natural gas line going into the house. Thankfully, I didn't break the line and blow up the whole neighborhood. So I clipped the remaining roots and moved the tree, and I felt into this new landscaped area, and I thought it looked great, and I felt I'd improved the home. I got married not too long after that, moved to a different house. Maybe a year after I got married and was in this new house, I drove by my old house and I slowed down to see what it looked like. The tree was gone. That whole new landscaped area I created was gone. And that's when I first truly understood the impermanence of our world. America has problems and decided to go in a new direction when it elected Biden to be president. As I showed, China has a whole host of challenges. Depending on what happens, Chinese, like Americans, might wish they could transplant their tree. But unlike Americans, they have no democratic means to do so. The last year and a half, maybe even before that, it's been difficult. It's been a tough time. There's no doubt about it. But it's important we look at the big picture. The last 70 years have been ones of remarkable progress. I talked earlier about the remarkable reduction in world poverty, but poverty has fallen in the United States during that time as well, although it's almost never reported on and certainly not talked about. And that reduction in poverty in America, that's true for all races and all ethnicities. And around the world, more people have access to education than ever before. Literacy is at all-time highs, child mortality rates are down, vaccinations are up. And speaking of vaccinations, COVID-19, as bad and as destructive as it's been on health, social, and economic factors, is driving amazing innovation. We developed a vaccine in record time. And this vaccine development isn't just great because of COVID-19. The new vaccine technology, the mRNA technology, it has applications for treating cancer, other viruses such as HIV, and even the common cold. It's possible in the future we won't even get common colds. So the pandemic has driven medical progress, as bad as it's been in other ways. The last few years have seen setbacks around the world, but if we stop and examine what helped us to be successful the last 70 years and what steps we need to take to continue and to involve and improve upon that success, there's no reason why the next 70 years can't also bring amazing amounts of progress, including China liberalizing and being a helpful contributor to the world. I'm actually somewhat optimistic that we can make that happen if we adopt the right policies as a world and work to liberalize China. Thanks very much for this opportunity. I'm happy to hear comments, take questions, ask me anything you want. I will not be shy in trying to answer them if I know the answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. This is Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs for World Oregon. And we've got a few questions here. If you've got a question for Sam based on what he's just talked about, please put it into the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. But so Sam, you might have touched on this a little bit, but what are your feelings about whether Biden will have the US rejoin TPP or some iteration of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have not talked to USTR representative, US Trade Representative about it. Don't have her on speed dial. But it's important to remember, so Trump opposed TPP in the 2016 presidential campaign, and he pulled the United States out of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when he became president. But we should also remember that President Hillary Clinton also opposed TPP during the 2016 campaign. being anti-trade agreement at that time was one of the last bipartisan positions that we had. So it's not clear that Biden will join TPP. He's talked a lot about creating alliances and wanting to do things more multilateral. Whether he's willing to do that or not is an open question. And in fact, it's important to remember he hasn't pulled off tariffs as some people thought he might, at least not yet. He has not done so. With China, he certainly hasn't done so. And probably he wants to hold that as leverage to deal with China and get some things back in his negotiations with China. But he hasn't really taken down many, if any, tariffs with the rest of the world either that have been in place for the last 4 years. TPP, and after TPP, there was a trade agreement that the ASEAN countries in Asia entered into with China. So there's a separate trade agreement now between China and these other Asian countries. So we really are falling behind. And TPP was created certainly in part to try and create a free trade agreement, but it was also done partly to counter leverage of China in that part of the world. The Obama administration, which negotiated TPP, they pointedly did not have China as part of that agreement. The idea was to create a set of rules and regulations that would set a standard that China would eventually have to follow. We lost America that leverage anyway when we didn't do that, but the rest of the Asian countries continued on, so that was probably helpful. So if I was a betting person, I don't know, I'd put a lot of money down that the Biden administration will have us re-enter TPP. I hope they will. I urge them to in my book, but they've got a lot of political pressure from labor not to. Although if they do try to enter TPP, I think they'll try and take some of the labor and environmental provisions that were put into the new, what was NAFTA and then became the USMCA, the US Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement. That was negotiated under the Trump administration, and labor had a lot of sway in those negotiations, and there were some new labor provisions put in there. So if we do try to re-enter TPP, I would guess they'd try to include these kind of provisions into it. Whether the other TPP countries will want that to happen is obviously an open question.
Well, so speaking of being a betting man, is there any speculation with your colleagues in the sort of China watching world of who might be the US ambassador to China?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I've heard all sorts of things, and I haven't heard much lately. It's been more quiet, so I don't know. There's been some speculation on some folks who I don't think I would want to be my ambassador to China, including, I'm going to forget his name, the head of Disney, who would have all sorts of conflicts of interest because Disney has a lot of business interest in China. So I hope it won't be someone like that. But yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. I heard more speculation a couple months ago. I haven't heard much lately.
Well, the other thing that has been, surfacing in the news a lot lately is the question about COVID-19 and the lab leak theory in China.
Yeah, it's gotten a lot of more attention in the last 2 or 3 weeks. It was sort of became more visible because the head of the WHO talked about they had not ruled out that as a possibility, and some other people had talked about it. And now you're seeing a lot of op-eds and articles about it. I'm not a virologist, but there's a good op-ed in the Washington Post, I believe it was yesterday, in fact, by a couple of people who are virologists. And they say we should definitely continue to investigate the possibility of a lab leak from the Wuhan lab in China. But they still say that it's more likely it's came from jumping from animals into the human population. And the reasons they give are very technical and talking about, looking at the genome and other things and the way the virus has evolved. And I'm not technically expert enough to say whether they're wrong or right. The Wall Street Journal had a different op-ed saying it was the most likely cases that came from a lab, but they weren't virologists. They had different scientific expertise. So I tend to believe the people who are in the field more than I would people who are not in the field. That being said, it's true. I think it's fair to say that the lab leak theory was underreported about last year. And I think that's partly because of the Trump administration, people not liking the Trump administration, and I don't like the Trump administration. I don't like Donald Trump at all, but we have to be very careful that we don't let our biases take us away from analyzing what's actually happening. So the lab leak theory by some in the media and some other folks tried to say, oh, it's just a conspiracy theory and has no basis and it should not even be covered, and people are trying to propagate it or being foolish. Well, that's not true. It is a possibility. What is definitely not true, according to the scientists in looking at the genome, is there's no evidence that this was manufactured in the lab as a bioweapon. But it is possible, as I read the science, that it's possible it leaked out of the lab. Either way, whether it leaked from the lab or jumped from animal to human, whichever scenario ends up being the case, and it may take years to determine that, and it would probably take longer because China has been, as usual, not allowing an open investigation, and they've been obfuscating. It's typical China government modus operandi. So they're at fault for some of these theories coming out, because if you look like you're hiding something, then people are going, or if you are trying to hide information, then people are going, well, why are you hiding information? But again, whether it jumped from natural animals to humans or it was a lab leak, either way actually reflects badly on China. It doesn't just have to be a lab leak to reflect badly in China. A lot of the viruses that we've been seeing happening, whether it's SARS back in 2003, and I happened to be in China when SARS happened in 2003. In fact, I got a cold when I came back, and I ended up with pink eye. And I remember the HR person at the place I worked told me not to come in, that nobody wanted to see me in the office, even though I definitely did not have SARS. If it's a lot of this jumping from animal to human has happened in China, and it's because of bad practices in a variety of other ways. If it's a lab leak, then yeah, they need a much better job of how they run their labs. Lab leaks have happened in the past. But even if it's not a lab leak, it doesn't speak good of China's practices and their regulations and how they handle things, including how they handled coronavirus in the very beginning. They did a good job of controlling afterwards with some very heavy-handed policies, but they did a horrible job when it first appeared, including arresting the doctors who were warning people about it. So people who want to get mad at China for the lab leak really need to step back and say, hey, it's not just a lab leak. Whatever the other circumstances, almost as bad as the lab leak. It may be just as bad as the lab leak. So it's a little odd to me that we focus so much on the lab leak as showing how bad China is when the other is also bad.
Well, interestingly though, whether it was their issue or not, from our side, these calling things the Wuhan virus and the Hong Kong flu, and I mean that are arguably or inarguably definitely promoted some, a lot of anti-Asian sentiment and violence. We were already dealing with the trade tariffs and a trade war. So, I mean, COVID in many ways was just sort of, icing on a really bitter cake. So what will it take for the US to recover, for the US and China to recover some sense of normalcy in terms of international relations post-COVID?
Yeah, well, first of all, I completely agree with you. Calling it the Wuhan flu and other terms that are even worse than that was completely reprehensible by the previous administration, by others who've used that. And I agree, I think it did contribute to anti-Asian violence we've seen, and it's inexcusable and we shouldn't do it. Our concerns and my concerns in the book have nothing to do with the people of China. It has to do with the government of China. The people of China are being oppressed by the government of China. So we need to stop this conflating of Chinese people and the government and saying, they're both the same thing. So I completely agree with you. In terms of trying to get relations back to a more normal pattern, I think the Trump administration and Trump himself certainly non-normalized a lot of things, including foreign policy and including how he dealt with other countries, saying things like the Wuhan flu, but also, he actually complimented President Xi, and he also told Xi, according to some newspaper accounts, that they could do whatever they want to Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So the rhetoric of the previous administration with China and with other countries and in general created a very inflammatory world. That being said, there's no reason why we need to say it's okay for China to have human rights abuses, or they can do whatever they want economically. We can do it in a diplomatic way, working with our allies. So when we say normalizing relations, we have to define what we mean by that. I think we should have a more normal type of rhetoric and not be saying things in an inflammatory and crazy way, but we can certainly push back, and we should be pushing back with our allies, as I argue in the book. We can work with our friends in Asia and Europe and South America and elsewhere to forcibly talk, not forcibly, but to forcefully talk about some of these big issues without having to, say them in inflammatory ways. And we can put together policies to try and encourage the liberalization of China and encourage them not to do some of the things that they've been doing, both in human rights and with their closed markets, stealing of technology and other things. It won't be easy, but I don't think that we should go back to what our policy and what the way we dealt with China pre the Trump administration either. The Obama administration, I think, did a lot of smart things. I think TPP was an attempt to try and contain China in certain ways, or not contain, but to try and deal with China. But there's the old saying by Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, talk softly and carry a big stick. The Biden administration was the Obama administration was mostly mute with China on some of these issues, and they carried at best a tiny twig. So I think there's a middle ground between both.
Well, so, you referenced in your talk that much of the world has sort of moved on from the US and from US leadership. But I'm curious, you've mentioned the Uyghur issue quite a bit. We still have a pretty loud megaphone. And do you think that the US can help create larger international will around the Uyghur issue?
I think we can. I don't think we can do it unilaterally. And I think we have to be a little different than we have in the past. And like I say, a lot of people will call us hypocrites because of our human rights problems, although our human rights problems are pale in comparison to what China does. But nonetheless, we do have issues here, of course. But we need to work with the rest of the world. Some people talk about trying to bring it up in the international court because they're what Anthony Blinken has called genocide. And there's a lot of misunderstanding what we mean by genocide. A lot of people hear genocide and they think we're talking about that genocide only means like in World War II, where Nazi Germany marched people into gas chambers. But there's actually an international definition under international law of what genocide means. And if you look at the law, a lot of people would say that what China is doing is committing genocide, including by trying to forcibly decrease the population. So yes, I think that's something we should do. Whether we can be successful or not, I don't know. It's a challenge. President Xi appears to have a very strong grip on power. There's also a lot of Chinese that it's not just the government. There are a lot of Chinese that think about the Uyghurs in a prejudiced way, as you have in other countries, and including America, who have prejudice against certain parts of our population. So it's something where we need to humanize the Uyghurs, both around the world and in China. A tough task. Of course, we don't have much access to providing information in China to the rest of the world now, but it's something we need to continue to work on.
You referenced the self-censure a little bit of, you mentioned Disney. Can you speak more about US corporations in tech and entertainment and elsewhere self-censoring to avoid a China boycott on issues like Taiwan or Uyghurs or other areas?
Yeah, it's a tough issue. I talk a little bit about it in my book as well, and it's tough for businesses, right? China is a huge market, both to sell to and it's a large part of the supply chain even today, even though some of it's been diversifying to other countries. And if you're a company, there's a good chance you're dealing with. If you're a large company, there's a good chance you're dealing with China in one way or another, whether selling or sourcing from there. And I'm not going to tell every company, hey, you can't do business in China. Boeing, where my wife works, their hope is to sell more and more planes in China. It's a big airplane market. And Boeing has always taken a stand that they don't get involved in those kinds of issues. I remember back in the days of South Africa apartheid, like they stayed in that market even when lots of other companies were pulling out, because they say we're a worldwide market, we sell to everybody. But I think there's a line that even if you're going to be doing business in China, you should try not to say things that are wrong and inflammatory from the other side. I use LeBron James as an example in my book. When Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets basketball team, did a very short tweet in support of the Hong Kong protesters, and then he was basically main persona non grata in China, and Chinese TV stopped carrying NBA games, and all this other big stuff happened. LeBron James, a number of NBA players just would say, "Oh, I don't know much about the issue," and they just try and get out of trying to answer it because they had business interest in China. LeBron James didn't do that. He basically said, threw Daryl Morey on the bus and really went around over and above basically protecting China. And that's not something that and I really treat him as a business in this case, or other businesses should do. I get they may need to be quiet and they won't take the lead in pushing for human rights issues, but they can be diplomatic and not be negative against them. But they are under a lot of pressure. I talked about H&M. There's other companies that have been under this pressure. I'm going to forget the name of it. There's actually there's a cotton association made up of all these different companies that use cotton, and they've now quietly stopped trying to pressure China on forced labor issues. So it's going to be one of the big challenges going forward in trying to deal with China. A lot of people want to talk about a new Cold War, and they'll compare what we're doing with the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union was never tied into the world economy like China is. China is the biggest trader in the world. Far more countries, China is their largest trading partner than is the United States. So it's a big challenge. And the Olympics is going to be another big one. The Winter Olympics in 2022 are in China. You have all these American companies and other global companies that are sponsors of it. And there's going to be there's people calling for boycotts. It's going to be an interesting terrain for companies to tread. I'm not saying they should pull out of China. I don't think we should have general decoupling. I think we should have strategic decoupling in different strategic areas. But I also don't think they should be exasperating the situation by completely giving in to China either.
So Taiwan, how can Taiwan best navigate its very fragile situation with China?
Yeah, it's a great question. In China, the Global Times, just the Chinese government newspaper in English, put out something about they have overwhelming force and can easily take over Taiwan, and the U.S. can't do anything about it. They just put that up last week. So there's been more and more threats. I think the two or three things we can do. One is we need to continue to help provide defense help to Taiwan, so they have the means to better defend themselves than they can probably today. We, with our allies, need to say, we will defend Taiwan. And third, we need to treat Taiwan like they are, a successful country. You're seeing more and more of that from the Biden administration. They invited the Taiwan, they're not the ambassador, but the equivalent ambassador, to come to his inauguration. There's this sort of illusion we've all been keeping that Taiwan is not a country. And sometimes I'll read about how China successfully squashed the coronavirus. There's some outbreaks happening there now. And so you really need an authoritarian government to do that. But there's been plenty of democratic countries that have done it, including Taiwan. Because I hear some people who say nonsense that, it's the Confucius attitude in China that allows them to do it. And you can't have democracy because of this Confucius attitude in China. Well, you have just off the coast of China, a very successful Chinese democracy, one of the most successful in the world, that also was able to contain coronavirus. So it's a lot of the things that people say are nonsense. But Taiwan is, one of the more successful countries in the world at this point. unlike China, their GDP per capita caught up much more than China's in their development. So it's really Taiwan is a country that should be held up as an example to the world, not a place that we should be shunning. But we do need to continue to provide them the ability to defend themselves and to talk about the consequences to China if they try to invade, both military consequences, but also, if China invaded Taiwan, at that point, I think it would be appropriate for the world to try to decouple from China. That would be a bridge too far for China to do that.
So we've had a couple interesting developments, in the last few months. Samantha Power has become the new head of USAID. She has a really good lens in terms of looking at issues around Africa. And then we have Ngozi, who is the new head of the WTO, and having the first African and first woman head of the WTO. Do you see any of these kind of developments shifting power balances or investment for China in Africa over the long haul?
Yeah, that's a great question. On the I'll answer the WTO first, and I'll admit that when I started writing my book, I thought I would basically say, oh, we need just to redo completely WTO, get rid of WTO. But as I did the research, you really find that WTO, most of the cases brought by the big countries in the world to WTO over the last 15 years were against China, and China lost these cases. It did not change China, but it did provide some leverage in making some changes in China. So I came around to WTO actually being a possible useful tool. It's not going to be the thing that completely changes China, but it's another tool in our toolbox. And an African being the head of WTO, I think, is helpful. I think trade is probably going to be the biggest way that Africa continues to develop. There's a great book called The Future Factory of the World, and it's about Chinese business investment in Africa. Again, business investment, not government investment, and how you're starting to see some possible African lions like we saw Asian tigers over the last 30 years as they develop their manufacturing capabilities. For the United States, I think if we need to encourage more companies to work with Africa. We always try to do a lot of aid, but it'd be great to get to the AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, more robust, and also to have some export support for our companies to do more business with Africa. And hopefully some of our companies will start to source from African countries. I think Africa, their demographics, unlike the rest of the world, are not trending to old. Basically, the whole world is trending to aging demographics, except for African countries and India a little bit. So I think Africa is a great opportunity for economic growth in the coming years. And Samantha Power has always been someone interested in human rights as well. So I think her taking that position will be interesting as well.
So we've got one last question as we come up to the top of the hour. In the truth is stranger than fiction category, any insight to the microwave attacks on U.S. diplomats that have occurred in Cuba, Russia, and in China?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've done a lot of reading on it, and I frankly have no idea what the real story is. I've heard some people saying it's just a bunch of baloney. Some people are really worried about it. I wish I could give a better answer, especially since this is the last question, but I honestly don't know what the answer is to that. I'm curious to see as we do more research on it, what that's about. I will say that we are entering an era where there's more and more powerful technology. And in my new book that I'm working on, I'm going to talk about that. And I'll use a quote by a scientist who said, with each passing year, the level of IQ necessary to destroy the world drops by 1, which is to say that more and more of us will have more and more powerful technology and dangerous technology as the world moves on. So we're entering into possibly a more difficult and dangerous time in history.
Well, great, Sam. As I'm communicating with Derek through my tinfoil helmet, I'm going to bring him back in to take us out into the day. I appreciate you being with us, and I appreciate all the questions, and we'll have you next time. Thanks. Thanks
for having me. Great speaking with y'all.
Thanks so much, Sam. And Tim will have to check that tinfoil helmet connection there. Really fantastic discussion, and appreciate you diving into all the controversial questions as well. Encourage folks to check out his book. We posted in the chat. Sorry, I posted a couple times. I want to make sure everybody got it because we had some folks who joined us late in the program. You can get it anywhere great books are sold, but I would especially recommend our local partner, Broadway Books, and there's a discount code in the chat. So look to that. That's also on our website. Will be up for today too, if you miss it in the chat. Hope to see you Thursday for a discussion with Tim Tran, a Vietnamese American, really inspiring story. That's at noon, Thursday, June 10th on Zoom. You can register for free on our website. Sam, stay in touch. Look to do more programming with you in the future, as this will never stop being a key part of the U.S. Relationship internationally going forward. So thanks again.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
All the best, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you Thursday.